What a day to show off my new t-shirt. I got this from The Second Shelf, which is a rare feminist bookshop in central London, in Soho. I recommend shopping there if you are in this country, and order from their webshop if you want, because they ship books. They also ship this t-shirt. Alright, that's enough shilling my favourite stuff. Let's talk about the 15 best books of 2020 in translation. Scratch that. My favourite translated books of 2020. Scratch that. Translated books is a bit of an awkward term. World literature, literature in translation. This is my actual job, and I don't know what to call it. Books that were originally written in a language that is not English and was brought to the English language through the talent and skill and hard work of wonderful translators from all walks of life and all different countries and cultures. You know what I'm trying to say. These are my favourite 15 novels in translation that were published in 2020 in English. Let's go. Number 15. Snow Dog Foot. That is the name of an Italian novel by Claudio Morandini and translated by J. Ockenden. This is a fantastic book. I'm going to say that probably every single time. This is a fantastic book. It is a charming and warm and witty and sweet narrative about a strange hermit who lives on a snowy Italian mountain. Up in the Alps, he lives in a little cabin, and he trundles down into the local town now and again when he needs stuff. The man, the hermit, befriends a dog, and the two of them have chats in human language. They talk and they are friends. And then they find a foot. This foot is just sticking out of the snow. The foot is attached to, maybe, or detached from, maybe, a dead person, maybe. And it's kind of a mystery about whose foot it is and how it happened and why it happened and what they're going to do about it. And so it's literally the title, Snow Dog Foot. It's a really, really fun book. It's not half as bleak as I thought it was going to be. It's a really jolly good time. J. Ockenden, they did an incredible job with this translation. They captured all of the fun and frivolity of this book, which, again, I didn't expect. It's a really, really fun time. I love Iceland. I haven't been yet. I love Iceland. I love Icelandic music. Shout out to Agent Fresco, best band in the world. And I love Icelandic literature. And so I'm trying to get my pronunciation right. And this, number 14, is Miss Iceland by Other Eva Olafsdottir. This fantastic book. I said it again. This book was translated by Brian Fitzgibbon from Icelandic into English. And it is a book about patriarchy. It's the story of a young woman from rural Iceland who moves to Reykjavik, and she moves in with her gay best friend, and the two of them have artistic dreams. She wants to be a writer and he wants to work in theatre, and the two of them hope to accomplish these things while patriarchy is telling them that women and gay men can't do these things. And so the two of them have to work menial, depressing jobs. He works on a fishing trawler, she works in a restaurant, while the two of them are trying to make ends meet, like any struggling artist, with patriarchy working against them. It's set in the 1960s, where the oppression is just felt a little bit heavier, but of course all of this oppression is still relevant to today. And it's an uplifting story in some ways, while also a very depressingly grounded book, especially when you see that so many of the things that these two are up against are still completely relevant. Yeah, it's a book that paints a very pure picture of patriarchy and what it does. The horrible, oppressive effects that it has. It's still a wonderful, wonderful book, and I really recommend it, especially for the poetic language, which Brian Fitzgibbon manages to capture so wonderfully in the translation. Number 13 is a book that's really, really important to me for a number of reasons. This book is Hunter School by Sakinu Aranglong, and it is translated by Daryl Stirk and published by Honford Star. This book is important to me for a number of reasons. Number one is that it is a book from Taiwan. Taiwan is one of my favourite countries. I love any excuse to go to Taiwan, to read Taiwanese books, to learn about Taiwanese history, and it just keeps going. There is so much rich, fascinating cultural and political history. Taiwan is an endlessly fascinating place. When it comes to its language, when it comes to its cuisine, Taiwanese food is the best food because it is food that has been inspired by so many different things, and that is also representative in the language and the place names and the architecture, etc, etc, etc. You've got the Portuguese. The Portuguese used to go to Taiwan and they used to trade with the Taiwanese, and they called it Formosa, the beautiful land, I think it means. And then you've got obviously the Chinese who settled in Taiwan. Taiwan is now its own country with its own democracy, but it has a constant power struggle with China, which is really depressing. Taiwan was also occupied by the Japanese Empire pre-World War II for a full 50 years, and the Japanese legacy, if you like, remains in Taiwan. Then you've got the fact that there are native Taiwanese people who call themselves Paiwanese, and that is who Sakunu Aronglong is. He is a native Paiwanese person who grew up in a village in the hills and forests of the very hilly and very foresty Taiwan. And it is his life story. It is the story of a young boy and his relationship with his father, his relationship with the Taiwanese city folk, if you like. And it is about, it's about a lot of things. It's a really short book. It's like 150 pages, and yet it tells a man's life. It tells his relationship with his dad. It tells his dad's life, and it tells the story of their native people in Taiwan and their relationship to the Taiwanese people, to the Chinese people, their past, their present, their future. Very ambitious book in a very small space of time, while still effectively being a kind of auto-fiction novel. Incredible. And another reason that it's really important to me is because it's published by Honford Star. And Honford Star are a very, very tiny press who deserve so much love and attention. All of the Korean books that they've translated and published, and now this as well, they're just fantastic. Check them out. Number 12. Number 12 is a French novel by Clara Dupont-Monaud, translated by Ruth Diver. I think it's Ruth Diver. And it is The Revolt. The Revolt is a 12th century historical fiction novel, really, really short for something that is so fantasy inspired and so historical. Usually historical novels, like the books of Ken Follett, are enormous tomes, as are big fantasy books. And this is kind of both of those things, and yet it's like 200 pages, which is really refreshing. And it tells the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, an incredible queen of this medieval period. And it is a book that is partly told by her son, Richard Lionheart, and it is their story. It is her story. It is a story of political intrigue and betrayal and sword swinging and beheadings and people being thrown in towers. It's a medieval fantasy almost, but it's not fantasy because it is historical fiction. But it reads like a fantasy. It's got all of the excitement. It's got all of the political intrigue and subterfuge of a fantasy novel. It's a genuinely fun and exciting book. And because it's so short, it's just all of the fat has been cut. It has just been trimmed and trimmed and trimmed down until all that's left is the good shit. It is pure diamond of a book. There is nothing wasted. It's just been trimmed and cut into this beautiful, perfect shape where not a word is wasted. It's a really fantastic, fantasy feeling historical novel that I just cannot say enough about it. And also the cover is stunning. Last Christmas, I was living in Bucharest, Romania. I spent my Christmas and New Year living there. It was really starkly depressing because it was winter and it was dark and it was cold. And at that time, I read like half the books on this list. They all came out really early in the year, and I got them all read and reviewed in that short space of time when I was in this tiny little flat in Bucharest. And 2 of those books were Korean, and those books have both ended up on this list, and they were my 2 favorite Korean novels of this year. The first of those was Untold Night and Day by Bae Soo-ah, and translated by the fantastic Deborah Smith. Now, Bae Soo-ah is quite a legend of Korean literature. Before I was living in Romania for Christmas, I was in London and I went to Foyles and I got to see her give an interview, and it was fantastic, absolutely brilliant. She is a charismatic character and she's a legend of Korean literature. So Untold Night and Day is a short masterpiece of a novel that tells the story of the kind of quarter-life crisis of a young woman who was an actress and now kind of works at a theatre box office, and Seoul is going through this horrendous, painful heat wave. And this is kind of a David Lynch-esque surreal story that's set over just 2 or 3 days as she falls into this fever. I'm going to say fever 100 times here, but that's exactly what it feels like. And also because reviewers and writers who are much better at this job than I am kept using that phrase, and nothing feels more applicable than fever It's a fever dream. And Lynchian. It's super Twin Peaksy. So it's the story of this woman who's going through a soul while it's in a heat wave, and that heat wave serves to represent and capture her inner turmoil and her inner frustration as she comes up to this boiling point while she's going through a crisis of career and creativity and personal strife, and feeling like she is superfluous within the state of her own life. It's absolutely fascinating. And it's a really short book, and I urge you to read it in a single sitting if you can. Just read it for a few hours over an afternoon, and it will just carry you into this dream state, or maybe nightmare is more appropriate, and you'll just get lost in it. And then suddenly you'll finish and you'll get sucked back out, and you'll think, I was in a book, I was reading, I didn't even know. I was so absorbed in this narrative that I felt like I lived in this feverish hot brain. It's good stuff. Okay, number 10 is hurricane season. I mean, yeah, everyone has said so much about this book. It was again, this is one of the books that I read at Christmas in Bucharest. I do not recommend reading this book at Christmas. I don't recommend reading it unless you are in a very strong state of mind. This is an exhausting book. So Hurricane Season is a Mexican novel by Fernanda Melchor and translated by Sophie Hughes. It was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, and it deserved to win it. Not that the winner didn't, but this is literally a masterpiece. I would say of all the books on this list, this is a book of my personal favourites, so don't come for me too harshly. But I would say that on a more objective level, if that's possible, this is the book on the list that is closest to being an absolute literary masterpiece. Hurricane Season surrounds the tale of a witch, this woman who lives in a cabin at the edge of a remote Mexican village. I kind of picture it as this swampy land full of degenerate people. This witch, she gives the young people of the village what they need when they may not be ethically, morally, politically, legally allowed to have it. For example, she gives the women abortions when they need them. She also basically gives her cabin to young people who are gay, straight, bi, whatever they want to be, to have giant orgies. So she does not kink shame, and I love her for that. But then suddenly she's dead. Oh shit, the book opens with her death, with her murder. And the narratives of the book are, it's like 5-6 chapters of different disparate narratives that kind of lead up to her death, follow her death, surround her death. And the way that it's written is almost more impressive than the themes and the story and the characters themselves, because this is a very experimentally written book where every chapter is kind of a diary entry or a first-person narrative, but every chapter is a single paragraph and every paragraph is a single sentence, and it's just these people spilling their guts and their opinions and their secrets onto the page. It is just bile and hate and anger and frustration spilled out onto the page. So beautifully written and gorgeously translated. It is a very intense book, and so you do have to be in the right mindset when you read it, but Jesus, it's a masterpiece. It is an absolute perfect work of fiction. The best book on this list. Not my favourite, but probably the best one. I happen to have number 9 on me. I think it's the only one that I have on me. No, it's not. Anyway, this is Theatre of War by Andrea Jevtanovic and translated by Francis Riddle. It is a Chilean novel published by Charco Press. I've talked about Charco a lot. I made a video specifically spilling my soul all about how wonderful Charco are, and I talked in quite a lot of detail about this book specifically, so I won't talk about it too much here. Theatre of War is a Chilean novel about how war affects our families. It is a book that follows the life of the youngest child of a family of refugees, migrants, I guess depends on how you spin it, refugees, who made it to Chile from a nondescript Eastern European country, and now this child has to grow up and kind of live her life. And it's a book about how your family shapes your life and how your family's life is shaped by their parents and their upbringing, and as it goes on, and we are chain reactions, effectively. And if that chain reaction, if one of the links in that chain reaction is destroyed by a war, then the rest of the chain is poisoned. The rest of the chain is brittle and broken and fragile. That's kind of what the book is about. The aftermath of war. The parents, especially the father, of this family are irreparably damaged by war, and now they have to try to live in a new country, fresh start, and raise their children as best they can, and those children tell their story. And it's called Theatre of War because it is told in a kind of theatrical way, as if it's on a stage, narrated by the playwright, if you like, and it's magnificent. This is the best book that Chaco Press published in 2020. It is the first, and at this point only, Chilean novel that they have published. It's the only Chilean novel that I have read at this point, and it should be read by everyone. Number 8 is Strange Beasts of China by Chinese author Yang Ge. It was translated by Jeremy Tiang, who did an exceptional job of translating. The book it's surreal, and it's quite grounded in its language, but occasionally throughout the book you get these little seeds. Imagine the book as a field, and you get these seeds that are planted throughout the book, which are just choice turns of phrase, little sentences and bits of language here and there that sprout into fantastic metaphors and beautiful descriptions, and they suddenly come at you random in these different chapters, and Jeremy Tiang did a wonderful job of nourishing these seeds and allowing them to sprout into something that will just bury itself into your mind and stay there. It's gorgeous language, gorgeous translation. Strange Beasts of China, I've talked about it in another video in quite a lot of detail, because when I made that video about Chinese literature, I was reading this book. So again, not too much detail. Strange Beasts of China is a series of short stories that are all interlinked together, so each one is a chapter, and they all together tell the story of this amateur/failed anthropologist who is also now a novelist, and she is investigating the beasts of the town that she lives in. These beasts are more like the races of Tolkien, if you like. They are kind of more like orcs and elves and dwarfs and whatever. They are a kind of form of human being, or gods, or demons. It really depends on which beast you're looking at for each chapter. It's a book with a lot of big ideas about minorities versus the majority. It's a book about how people are treated depending on their culture and depending on what city and country they live in. It's got a lot of big ideas, but also it's quite simply a very esoteric and surreal story. Absolutely chock full of wild imagination. I think that's the book's biggest selling point, is that this is just Yang Ge's imagination just left to wander and roam and see what it picks up and what it can come up with. It is a book about fantastical world building and character building, where you have these different races of people known as beasts, and each of these races has a different backstory. They have a different genealogy. They have different physical attributes. They have traditions and a personal genetic history, and they have traditions and religions, etc. And one of these races turns out to be gods, the actual gods that created human beings. Wild and wonderful imagination. Really incredible book. I loved it from start to finish. It gripped me all the way through. I cannot sing its praises enough. It's an addictive novel because of the imagination that just keeps getting pushed further and further into extremes, as there is an overarching story where our main character starts to learn more about herself in respect to the beasts that she learns more about and kind of interviews and investigates and etc. Great book. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Bae Soa's book, Untold Night and Day, that there was another Korean book that I read really early in the year that I recommend, and that book is Be, Book and Me by Kim Sagwa and translated by Sun Hee Jung. I read this book, again, back in like January, and I thought it was going to be one of the big books of the year, big Korean publications. And from what I can tell by living on the internet, it kind of wasn't. It's a book that I absolutely adored, and it kind of just fell by the wayside in terms of the larger, louder discourse. Please read Be, Book and Me. If you like slice of life coming of age Japanese anime, this has that feel, and I love that stuff so much. So it's set in this small Korean town. The Be, Book and Me of the title are kind of the three protagonists, Be, Book and Me. And it's a coming of age story. It's about their relationships with each other. It's about them bonding together, if you like, and it's exciting, gripping narrative, but the town itself takes on this surreal quality. The book starts off very grounded, and as it goes, it becomes more surreal step by step, which is fantastic world building, really good pacing and plotting, and the town almost feels like an unknowable place. It's a labyrinth where the walls and the tunnels shift and change, and that's how the surrealness of it starts to set in. So it's a coming of age story. All the while the characters kind of feel lost and confused and frightened. Really gorgeous, gorgeous writing. Bee Book and Me slipped under the radar a little bit this year, and I refuse to let that happen. Please read this book. Kim Sagwa is a fantastic writer, and Bee Book and Me is such a charming and clever book. If there's one book on this list that I feel like it didn't get enough attention and it needs more, and I demand that you read it, it's Bee Book and Me. My favourite Korean novel of 2020. Okay, before I get to my top 5, number 6 is going to be on so many people's lists. I've already seen it on loads of top books of the year lists around Twitter, etc. And that is Tender is the Flesh. So Tender is the Flesh is an Argentinian novel by Agustina Basterica. I love Argentinian literature so much. I love dystopian literature. And that's what this is. It is the dystopian novel of 2020. If this year has left you black and bruised and your teeth are on the floor and you are exhausted and you are about to keel over, don't read this book. Having said that, it's my number 6 book on this list. It is an absolute masterpiece. Do I call it a masterpiece? It does have a few issues actually, but I feel like any issues kind of get swept under the rug because ultimately the theme of this book is what's most important. Tender is the Flesh. Did I already say this? I can't remember. Just in case, it was written by Agustina Basterica and translated by Sarah Moses. I'm not sure if I said that. It's a dystopian book about a farm where they farm humans for their flesh. A kind of subgroup of humans that are battery farmed, raised specifically to be eaten. And so they are referred to as heads, not people. Because if you eliminate the humanity, then you don't feel guilty, right? So it's a book very much forcing us, or at least asking us, to question our habits when it comes to what we eat, what we farm, what we kill. It's a book about ethics and morals. It's kind of simple. You know, it's not unusual for a story to ask questions about our morals and our ethics. These books published every 5 minutes. This one manages to grab your attention because of how bleak it is and how raw it is. This is a book of intense power and description. It makes you feel uncomfortable, and it kind of is, rather than asking questions, it grips your head and it turns you towards a battery farm full of chickens and says, fucking look at that. Look at what you're doing. Look at the state of our world. Would you eat people? If you wouldn't eat people, why are you eating pigs? That kind of an effect it has, you know, it feels like a book written by Peter. I am someone who constantly struggles with my eating habits. I don't eat pork because pigs are clever. And then I say to myself, well, if you don't eat pigs, then why do you eat cows? And I actually don't, because I just hate beef. It's not good for you. But then, you know, why do you eat chickens? I love chicken. Should I keep eating chicken? I don't know. Should I be a vegetarian? Should I be a vegan? Maybe a pescatarian, if nothing else. And I go through these questions all the time. And if you do, this book will have an effect on you. It'll have an effect on you no matter what you are. No matter how much of a carnivore you might be. It's a book that forces us to ask some really difficult questions and at least come up with 1 or 2 answers for them. So yeah, it's a dark, frightening dystopian book about farming and eating people. And it is absolutely one of the best novels of this year. I don't know what that says about this year. It just got dark outside because it's 3 p.m. and that's how winters. So my lighting's really terrible now, and I don't have any lighting equipment. Sorry. Another sorry is that my top 5 books are all Japanese novels in translation. I am a Japanophile. My favourite books usually come from Japan, so my top 5 is all Japanese books. What are you gonna do? Recently, I made a video about Japanese crime novels, and I talked quite a lot about a fantastic book that I finished and read quite recently. It was my final review of this year, and it ended up as my 5th favourite novel of the entire year, and that is The Decagon House Murders. The Decagon House Murders was translated by Ho-Ling Wong. Oh, and it was written by Yukito Ayatsuji, and it is a book that in many ways is a love letter to Agatha Christie, specifically her masterpiece And Then There Were None. But it is also a fantastic, compelling murder mystery novel in its own right. The Decagon House Murders is set on an island off the coast of Japan where a group of university students who are mystery novel addicts start getting picked off one by one. The island itself has a dark history, a very recent dark history, so in a way a dark present if you like, but these kids were daring enough to go there anyway because they are addicts of this type of a thing. But they still, as punishment for that, are getting picked off. And the question is, of course, who? This book feels like an Agatha Christie novel. That is one of its biggest accomplishments. It feels like it was written by Agatha Christie. It is still very quintessentially Japanese, quintessentially modern. It is different, but it still feels so beautifully Christie-esque, and so if you're a fan of hers, you will be a fan of this. I didn't expect a book like this. When I'm so new to the genre, I didn't expect it to be my number 5 of 15 for this entire year, but it's such a fantastically well-written and wonderfully translated book. So yeah, Decagon House Murders, check it out. My number 4 and number 3 books were both translated by Polly Barton. Polly Barton also has a non-fiction book of her own coming out next year, published by Fitzcarraldo Editions, who published Hurricane Season, so check that out when it comes around April time. Polly Barton is just... oh man, she's incredible. So my number 4 pick is There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job. This is a novel by Kikuko Tsumura and published by... I've got it here. It's published by Bloomsbury. This is fantastic. Of course, it's my number 4 book. This is the story of a woman who... Polly told me that every story in this book was inspired by the author, not because the author did the job, but because it was a job that she would take if she could. Like, I've always wanted to be a postman. If I were to take a pretty chill job, I always thought that I would try to become a postman. Postal service just seems like a really endearing job to me. And I found the case to be true with a lot of the jobs that are in this book because, well, that's exactly what Tsumura did, is that she researched these jobs and went, I'd love to do that, so I'm going to make my protagonist do it. Anyway, what's the book about? There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job is the story of a woman who, I think she's around 30, 35, and she's had it up to here with abuse and corporate structures and the salaryman lifestyle of Tokyo, and she wants an easy job. And so we have 5 chapters, each chapter being a different job that she tries out for a month, 2 months, whatever, as she's trying to search for an easy job. Over and over, she gets an easy job and figures out along the way that what she actually wants is a fulfilling job, a job that makes a difference, a job that gives her life meaning, because easy jobs don't do that. But neither does a generic corporate office job in central Tokyo. That doesn't do it either. So she's trying to figure out what she wants out of life as she goes from job to job. And it's a really sweet tale where we get to learn more about our nameless protagonist as she goes through these jobs. We get to learn more about the jobs themselves and kind of what makes a job rather than the work itself. You know, your colleagues, the people around you. It's such an entertaining read. It really is. Absolutely. It's a decently sized book. And I can't say enough good about it. My number 3 book is Where the Wild Ladies Are by Aoko Matsuda. This was again translated by Polly Barton, and it is a modernization of traditional Japanese ghost stories told through a modern lens and, more importantly, a feminist lens. These are all ghost stories that highlight misogyny, that highlight sexual inequality, gender inequality in some way. It's a little bit queer in places, it's romantic in places, it's dark in places, and it's funny in places. It's a collection of traditional Japanese ghost tales reworked and rewritten with a modern feminist lens. That's pretty much all you need to know. And then just go in blind and enjoy these stories. Again, they were translated by Polly Barton, published by Tilted Axis Press. Gorgeous, gorgeous stories. It's my number 3 spot. I'm not going to say much about it because I need you to read it. My number 1 and number 2 spots kind of interchanged. I read both books in the summer and I've had 6 months to sit on them both and just think, and I couldn't decide what my number 1 and number 2 should be. In the end, I have settled on Earthlings by Sayaka Murata and translated by Jinitapu Takimori as my number 2 book. Now, I've done a video about this, I've done a written review of this, and I've featured it in lists. I've put this book everywhere. Convenience Store Woman, her first book in English, is my 3rd favourite novel of all time, ever. Full stop. And Earthlings is another piece of masterful Japanese literature by a punk and angry feminist writer. Watch my video on it. I'm not going to say anymore. And my number 1 book is Breasts and Eggs. Breasts and Eggs was written by Mieko Kawakami, translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd, published by Picador, and it's my favourite book of this year. Again, I've made a video and a written review of this book. And although this ends the video on a bit of a limp note, both of these books mean the world to me. And I need you to just go watch these videos and, more importantly, read the fucking books. Breasts and Eggs is, in my opinion, the best book of 2020. It is a perfect Japanese feminist novel that everyone must read right now. I'm not saying anything more about this or Earthlings. Just read them both if you haven't. They are my favourite books of this year. They are perfect. They are the best. Don't fight me on this. These are the two best books of 2020. All right, Merry Christmas. Subscribe.